Shabbat Shalom, everyone, from Beit Virtuali. One of the great challenges that I've had as a pastoral counselor over the last years, and I know that I'm not alone in this, as I've spoken with other people who work as therapists, is helping to walk someone through the process and counsel them through the process of cutting out someone who has been toxic in their lives. And I've seen a lot of posts on social media recently that reflect this. Don't judge someone who doesn't have a relationship with their parent. You don't know what kind of toxicity they've dealt with, so have compassion for them. And all these are very true things. But I have to push back just a little bit before we dive deeper into this and look at our weekly Torah portion that has, believe it or not, something to say about this. And that's that there is definitely a continuum. On the one hand, there are acts of unspeakable burden that are, well, when we say toxic, it means that a person, if they still have a relationship with that person, it is dangerous for them, profoundly, physically, mentally, emotionally dangerous. But on the other hand, since 2016, I've had these conversations with people where the crime of the other person is voting for the other political party, and I understand how problematic and how perhaps the worldview of that person on the other side might seem to be so abusive in and of itself, but that's a radically different continuum. And it's worth being aware of, I disagree with someone versus I really am not safe to be around that person. Now, we have a fascinating, it's just called an isolated verse in the Parashat from this week. So we are reading from verse 22 in chapter 35 of Exodus in Vayishlach. Vayhi bishkon Yisrael be'eretz hahi. So when Israel was still away in the other land, meaning he wasn't in his tents, he was dealing with the death of Rachel at the time. Vayelech Reuven. So Reuven walks, or Reuven goes. You add that extra verb there when it means that Reuven is leaving his everyday. He's doing something different than he would normally do. And what does he do? Well, Vayelech Reuven ve'ishkav et Bilha pilegesh Aviv, and he goes and he lays with Bilha, so the mother of two of Jacob / Israel's sons, Reuven's brothers, Dan and Naphtali, one of the two concubines. So we have Rachel and Leah, and each of them had a handmaid, and that was part of the marriage gift dowry. According to Midrash, these were actually half-sisters of Rachel and Leah. It's complicated. It's obviously not a good situation. And then we have this wonderful verse, Vayishma Israel. So Israel hears of this. Seems like there should be a lot more to the story. But instead, even though the verse continues, if you read this in the Torah, there's an entire gap. Now, there's no punctuation in Torah, but we have the partial gaps, like a little opening there that says it's the end of a thought, or we have the full big gap, ptuach, an open part. So the next thing is just tacked on, or it seems to be tacked on, and what we read is Veyu bnei Yaakov shneim asar. And so the number of Jacob / Israel's sons were 12. Of course, in this case, the name Israel is used instead of Jacob. It's a strange little verse. We don't really find what the result of this is until later on, once we get to the end of the book of Genesis and Israel is dying and he gives the blessings. They're not always really blessings, but he speaks prophecy or gives blessings to each of his 12 sons. And when it comes to Reuven, we find out that the result of this is that he's no longer trusted, which kind of sort of makes sense. But this is really the beginning of our understanding that Reuven has problematic morals. And as we'll see in his role as a ringleader for what happens to his brother Joseph, perhaps the first son, in this case, who should be the one who carries the rulership, the authority of the father through the rod, as it were. Well, this actually passes on to Judah. Now, stepping into academics for a little while, there's a reason that has to happen, because we trace ourselves as a people who once had a king through the David line, and David was part of the tribe of Judah, so therefore the story had to be written this way. That's for a different time, but we're definitely finding out something about Reuven. But what in the world is this verse about other than a little bit of foreshadowing? And our clue comes from Ramban, so Nachmanides, who actually ties that last little thing, that last little after the big gap in the Torah, to the rest of this, saying that it's actually the most important thing. And if we actually look at the text more carefully, first of all, the name that's used here is important. Because after Jacob becomes Israel, after Jacob, the trickster, the liar, the morally problematic, wrestles with God, or wrestles with that which is greater than him, wrestles with something, is in dialogue with something other than his own ego. After this point in his life, we still don't always see that he has gained a new nature. Sometimes in the narrative, he's named Israel, and sometimes in the narrative, he's named Jacob, which is one of those, for our own personal psychic growth, is one of those things we need to keep in mind, because I know that when I mess up, which is way too often, I sometimes sit there and say, damn it, Paul, what are you doing? That self-recrimination, which, yes, we need to be self-aware and we need to improve ourselves and we need to ashamnu begadnu, we need to do what we need to do to improve ourselves. But just because I learned something doesn't mean that I've learned it. Just because I've had an insight doesn't necessarily mean that I'm able to, for whatever reason, sometimes it's being tired or hungry or angry or whatever, it doesn't mean that I'm able to enact that new learning, that new wisdom in every moment of my life. And Torah deals with this in a beautiful way. All the intimacy we get to see about Jacob, when Jacob is still acting like Jacob, even after he's Israel, he's called Jacob. But when he's acting elevated, he's called Israel. And in this case, we see Vayishlach, and it was counted for Israel that he had 12 sons. Nachmanides says, well, that's exactly the entire point, because his eldest son just did something pretty dang unforgivable. But he was still counted as one of his 12 sons. Now, the easy takeaway here is maybe the most problematic one, and I want to suggest it but not make it the point of what I'm trying to say, and that's that we should perhaps give more gravity to the act of cutting someone out of our lives. If we actually are in the process of removing someone from being in everyday contact, now whether this happens through ghosting or whether this happens through some other level of ignoring or telling them directly, I want nothing to do with you, or any of those other ways that we can do this, it is sometimes absolutely necessary, without a doubt. And of course, I don't know you. I can't step into your brain and know when that's necessary. But there is absolutely a continuum. And right now we have been given permission by society to cut out relationships very easily. Ghosting is a word in our vocabulary for a reason. And anyone who's ever been on the receiving end of being ghosted understands that it is terrible and terrifying and excruciating. And to repeat the thing that I've said in so many sermons in adult education and to so many friends and congregants, for every person that we are in therapy because someone is in therapy because of us, the act of cutting someone out of our life needs to be taken with gravity. First of all, with the humility of understanding that we are as often the victimizer as we are the victim, no matter who we are, no matter what our status is, no matter what our place in society. We as human beings victimize others. Part of Torah is not always just identifying with the Hebrews as they were enslaved. It's also identifying with Pharaoh, who is doing the enslavement. We have both archetypes so that we can actually look at ourselves in the mirror and say, we are capable of both. If we don't understand we're capable of atrocity, then we are ignoring so much harm that we ourselves can do. So there's that humility when we cut someone off to ask the questions on what we have done. Now, what I really want to get at with this is I don't think that Nachmanides is saying, hey, that's the threshold by which we understand if we have a relationship with someone. Look what Reuven did, and he was still counted as a son of Jacob. Because there were consequences. Reuven did something horrible. He lost the trust of his father. And the consequences, he lost the direct authority being passed through him. It went to Judah instead. So I'm not saying that there aren't consequences and that we shouldn't take responsibility for protecting ourselves. What I'm saying is this. If we enter into that contract with someone in our lives as we are born, with parents, with relatives, with people who come into our lives that we love, even if it's for the wrong reasons, that contract carries with it a weight. Reuben being counted as one of the sons was not an acknowledgement that Jacob had trusted him with the same level of trust that he did before. It's an acknowledgement that Reuben was still his son. So that's the thing. Even if we have a toxic ex-partner, or God forbid, a parent that we've had to cut out of our lives, or a sibling or a cousin, they're still our sibling or cousin or parent. And that means that we're affected, whether we want to admit that we're affected or not, which means that the act of ghosting doesn't remove the problem. The act of ghosting still has left us with that person in our lives. The reflection, the fact that they are still our parent, cousin, ex-wife, ex-husband, ex-partner, sister, brother. And those relationships are important. On our last podcast, the Rabbi and I had a long discussion on what does it mean to honor your father and mother. And a lot of that discussion was to recognize that these relationships have gravity, that they affect us. And so what I really want to say is, well, of course, Jacob still acknowledged that Reuben was his son. He still had to deal with the reality of him in his life. And I think as we have made it easier and supported each other, and sometimes in the most important ways, to cut people out of our lives that are toxic for us, we still haven't taken the next step as a society and understand that that's the beginning of a long process of healing. And healing is an active process that involves understanding that pain just doesn't go away. That our job as humans is to overcome that actively, not to sit there and live with it and to build our identity around the fact that that person hurt me, but to find our way past it through the processes that are so painful to even say, such as forgiveness, such as letting go. And Judaism is predicated every year on bringing us to the cycle of asking which of our relationships need tending. And even if we can never talk with someone again because that's dangerous, that gravity, that relationship still exists. That child is still our child. That parent is still our parent. Even if we can't have anything to do with them, they're still a part of us, which means that we are not whole until we have figured out a way to deal with that. And the final message is, well, when we are Jacob, that's almost impossible to do. And I believe that if Jacob would have been the personality that was at play here in this Torah portion, then it would have said something like, and the number of sons counted to Jacob were 11. But it wasn't Jacob, it was Israel. It was our higher evolved selves, the persons that we're trying to work to, the person that needs to not just be the person who doesn't hurt others, but the person who recognizes how much we have hurt others. Once we put ourselves in the continuum of being as able to hurt as of being hurt, we're going to look at these things a little bit differently. And it's hard because looking in the mirror can be really brutal. But it's also part of how we use, well, this moment in time, this joy of Shabbat, the profound messages of Torah, to actually open our hearts instead of close them, to actually begin processes of healing instead of stay within processes of pain, to elevate each other and ourselves. And with that, I say to you all, Shabbat Shalom.
Shimon Adonai Baruch Hu Shemo Basru Miyom Le'yom Yeshuato